a deep honor and privilege to meet Shawn DuBravac. He's come all the way from the United States. He's an author, he's a futurist, he's at a conference here. But what connects me to him, even though I've just met him a few minutes ago, is that we both are fellow futurists. We sort of live in the future. And one of the things that he is doing in his book, and we'll talk about this, is actually intercepting the future, actually engaging with the future and bringing it in today's terms. And even with a few minutes looking at the book and reviewing it, there's some real gems in there that I've already discovered. So today is going to be a conversation about the future, about data, about how society, humanity, and technology converge and intersect. Shawn, real pleasure. Good to have you here.
It's so great to sit down with you.
Thank you very much. What's your story? Where did everything start for you?
So my background is in economics and finance. I have a PhD in economics and started there. And over time, as technology became a bigger part of my portfolio, I started noticing these forces that were developing, and they were starting to come together. Some of them had been building over decades. The first digital computer showed up in 1942, the first hard drive showed up in 1956, but it would be decades before those technologies became ubiquitous. Yeah. And I saw these forces coming together and redefining not only the workplace, but society broadly. And so that's what drove this first book. What I see happening now is we're moving from this period of digitization to datafication, where the information, much of it that was already out there, but wasn't being captured, collected, organized, is slowly being gathered, repurposed, and as a result, it's creating entirely new service opportunities. So it isn't just changing how we do something, but it's fundamentally changing what we do. It's changing the type of communication that we have, not just how we communicate. And we see that happening in lots of different places. Yeah.
Indeed, and we'll do a deeper dive in that. But before we go in there, can we take a step back and talk to Shawn, a young Shawn. Were you a naughty child at school? Or were you geeky at school? What inspired you there?
I was definitely the kid who was always out exploring and wandering and doing natural experiments. Some of those successful and some of those, like any child, unsuccessful. And so I was constantly exploring the world around me, looking for patterns, looking for things that connected, trying to understand how things worked. So I was the kid who would take apart the radios, and I knew that I wasn't destined to be an engineer when I could take it apart but not put it back together. Yeah. And so curiosity and a very strong sense of curiosity drove me as a child and then continues to drive me as an adult.
It's a brilliant answer, because I think one of the key attributes as we go into the future are things like curiosity and experimentation and just tinkering and so on. Do you think that schooling actually helped you or actually slowed you down?
That's a great question. I think that school helped me because it gave me exposure to individuals who showed me a new way of thinking and a new way of structuring information. And so it allowed me to explore new areas that I might not have naturally sought out. Yeah. And a big part of exploration is not necessarily finding what you love, but learning what you don't love, learning the things that you don't like. Right. And so as I've gone throughout my professional career, a lot of it was moving towards those things that I liked and moving away from those things that were perhaps less interesting to me.
Who were your early inspirations in your life? Anybody that you can remember? Perhaps your teacher, perhaps your dad? Who were your inspirations?
Sure. I mean, I look at my family, and I've always been surrounded by a family that has been curious. We traveled a lot, and so I was exposed to a wide swath of individuals. From a very young age, had the chance to live in many different parts of the world and travel to many different parts of the world, and that has helped inform me and educate me. So I would say I was influenced by many people. There isn't just a single one, but my brothers and other family members influenced me. Teachers clearly influenced me. My dissertation advisor influenced me. So there's always influence. And I think that's an important part of being human, is being able to be influenced.
Yes, indeed. You come from old Yugoslavia, modern Croatia,
Yeah.
I understand. And one of the key things probably is more relevant to your dad and your grandfather, who originally came down, is that immigrant mentality of survival, of pursuit, of taking on challenges and winning. Is that something that helped you grow as a person as you were a young child?
Definitely. I think that growing up as a second generation American helped me, and I was always instilled with a very strong work ethic from both of my parents, and willing to really dive into something head first. I tend to be one who doesn't necessarily look at the consequences, but I'll dive in and begin exploring and see where it takes me. So I think that work ethic has been key to where I am today.
We discussed your earlier stage of your life. Now, as you meandered your way into business and into becoming a PhD and your dissertation and work, how did you discover that process and how did you find your passion?
So I followed lots of different directions, and if you would have asked my brothers when I was when I was younger what I was going to be when I grow up, they would have given you a million different answers because I was always going in different directions, always exploring lots of different directions. And as part of that exploration, I ended up taking classes in economics, and I loved that it gave me a framework in which to think about that exploration. It gave me tools and techniques to structure that exploration. And so that's one of the reasons why economics resonated with me and why finance resonated with me. I liked the quantitative aspects, but more broadly, it gave me this framework for exploring the world. I loved exploring how markets operated and understanding why sometimes they fail, and exploring what drives those.
Sure. Tell us about the book, and one, what the inspiration was, and secondly, what is the essence of it for you? And then we'll go and do a deeper dive.
Digital Destiny is about these forces that are coming together and that have been coming together for decades, and ultimately the impact that those forces in combination have on who we are, how we work, how we communicate, how we play. All of what we understand to be life is changing now because of these forces that have been, some of them in action for decades, now coming together. And it's that combinatorial innovation that's changing things. It's the combination of all these forces that changes things.
You talk about data and information, and it always takes me to Moore's law, is how we keep exponentially growing, because once something becomes information driven, then you can become exponential. Would you throw some light on that?
Yeah, I think you see Moore's law showing up in lots of different ways. We think about it primarily in transistors, and then we think about that in terms of processing power. But the implications, and Metcalfe's law with respect to networks and other things, the implications of exponential growth and exponential change is showing up in lots of different places. And one of the key aspects that I see in that is that it changes not only how we do it, that we can do it faster, quicker, better, but it also fundamentally changes what we do. So one example that I always look at is image sensors. Early on, we used to include just one image sensor on our smartphones, and we could take a picture. As we included a second image sensor on our smartphones, we would put not just one on the back, but one on the front. It introduced the world of selfies, and we can argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yes, we can.
More people die trying to take selfies than in shark attacks, so maybe it's not a great thing for society, but it fundamentally changed how we used that technology. So the introduction of another sensor, because sensor prices went from a scarcity, an expensive resource, to an inexpensive resource, we could then waste it in a technological, economic sense. And that's something that I think you see happening, is the wasting of technology, because it moves from a scarcity to a surplus. It moves from a scarcity to an abundance, from an expensive resource to an inexpensive resource, and then we can deploy it widely. And as we do that, we learn new things. So technology is also exploring. as we put things together.
Indeed, I mean, I love the fact that you talk about abundance, and I do too, constantly. We're living in the most abundant times ever.
Definitely.
And everybody thinks about like all the issues because our sort of amygdala clicks in because of our news and stuff, that the world is a really terrible place. It's not. It's the best it's ever been, right?
Yes, and getting better.
And getting better. And mortality rate is low, less wars, less deaths, literacy is high. So when you look at all of those things, we are getting better and better. Now, one of the things that drives me, and I loved your last chapter here, the year is 1450. This is the innovation of the printing press, which is a very nice little sort of setting and a backdrop. And we call them those Gutenberg moments. And that was a Gutenberg moment, and that changed life. How do you relate that to the new Gutenberg moments do we have, and how many do you feel that are happening at the moment?
So if you look at the original Gutenberg moment, we so often see it as just the ability to print, and now we accelerate that and we get books in more hands. But it had a much bigger impact on society. It drove literacy rates, it drove religious reformation throughout much of the world, it drove a restructuring of the class system in a lot of the world. So the ability to mass produce books at a lower price, mass producing books as we knew it in that time, didn't just change that we had more books, but it changed everything that touched. And that's what you have today, is you have more change touching more things, which collectively means that society is undergoing a more rapid shift than we've ever seen before, and we're redefining what that means.
For me, there are at least 20, 25 Gutenberg moments, and I can think of nanotechnology, I can think of sensor technology, I can think of biotech, many other areas that are there, and each one of them is fundamentally changing things. So I see a double whammy here. We've got all of this abundance and then convergence, and when that convergence and abundance happens, and you have the crossover points, it further accelerates and has a multiplier effect. So bringing back to where data comes in this multiplier effect, how do we cope as human beings?
And I call those moments combinatorial innovation. It's taking separate innovations and putting them together, which together creates something entirely new. And I think that at the end of the day, sometimes we lose focus that we see all these technologies, we think this is technological shifts that are taking place, and we use terms like digital transformation. But at the end of the day, it's still about the human. And these technologies are about improving the human experience. Now, we don't always get it right. And if you look at the world today, you can see a lot of places where technology is getting it wrong. But that's the other thing that takes place in this environment of combinatorial innovation, is you have iteration and iteral innovations. So technology creates positive outcomes and also creates some negative outcomes. In the terms of economics, we call those externalities. So we have positive externalities, we have these negative externalities. Technology also does a very good job, driven by humans, to come back and address some of those negative externalities over time. So kind of one example that I think of in history is you look at email. Email made it much easier to communicate. It made it so that we could share information more widely, more quickly. It also created spam. So that's one of those negative externalities. It created lots of positive, but also a few negatives. And then over time, technology developed things like spam filters to address some of those negative externalities. Early on, technology is not very good, and we would rely on, we wouldn't rely on it very heavily. We'd go in, we'd check our spam filters. But then over time, as the technology improves, we begin to rely on it more heavily.
As I travel and speak internationally, one of the rhetorical questions I ask, and with your permission, I'll ask you the same, and that is that as we are in this digital revolution, what are the 3-4 pillars on which the future will stand? What are the foundations of the future? So if we project ourselves in the year 2030, what, in your opinion, are the top 2 or 3 things that will define our lives by the year 2030?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's lots of forces coming together, as we've already alluded to. Clearly, we're seeing data take on a more pronounced role than it has in the past. In many of these instances, it was data that was already there, it was information that was already available but wasn't being structured. And digitization enables us to structure that and then ultimately redeploy it. So AI is just a redeploying of data into new ways. I think that becomes a key pillar of what the world looks like over the next decade. Clearly, the human it will play a vital role, and you can't write out the human. As we automate routine tasks, you're going to see cognitive capabilities become ever more important. So things like creativity, intuition will become extremely important in areas where automation can't go.
Indeed, and what I start with as my rhetorical answer to the question is that the future is going to be defined by trust, by ethics, by humanity, by values, and by empathy. And the reason I say that is that you can have fintech, but if you don't have compliance and ethics, nothing will work. You can have biotechnology and designer babies, but if our moral compass is not in place, it won't work. You can have all the IoT in the world that is out there, but if we can't love, if we don't have empathy, if we can't connect, it won't work. So my thesis on this one is, and this is more of a general conversation with you, is that in this world of massive data coming through, how do we remain more human?
I think that we will see data enable us to hopefully focus on some of these key pillars, as you call them. So things like empathy, things like trust.
Yeah.
You already see technology coming in certain ways to help address some of those issues. So blockchain technologies and distributed ledgers are designed to build systems of trust so that we can enter into transactions more quickly in a trust environment.
Yeah.
But I think you'll also see data enable us to become more empathetic. So if I am able to understand things about my environment that I wasn't able to decipher with my own senses, if I'm able to understand how my friends are doing in a deeper way because of data, then ideally I can become a better friend. I can become a better part of that community.
That's true, but we're at an EdTech conference, an HR tech conference here, and you know, all of this AI sensor-based recruiting systems are coming in and so on, and a lot of them are being deployed as we speak. It takes that human element out. And I can understand the repetitive automated part of it, but I'm just wondering whether we're becoming too intrusive in terms of who we are as people, and therefore dependent on supportive technology, like AI technology, telling us what to do rather than using our own judgment and our own thinking, our own compass.
Yeah.
And I'm concerned about that.
So I think, again, there is this balance that takes place between where we want computers to rule and where we want humans to take control and to use those cognitive capabilities that are so important, things like empathy, intuition, creativity. And so it's about using the best of what computers can offer as well as the best of what humans can offer. And we have seen in countless examples where computers might best a human, things like chess, put together the best humans with the best chess programs are still the ones today that are winning chess tournaments. And so it's about taking the best of both of those worlds and bringing them together.
You know, when I hear about AI, and most people call it artificial intelligence, I actually call it augmented intelligence, because it helps to augment whatever you have and it supports you. And a friend of mine, she's a show jumper, a host show jumper. And when she saw one of my presentations, it was wonderful. She said, I actually totally get it, because when I ride my horse, it's 10 times bigger and 50 times stronger, but I ride it. Give it a bit of love, and I ride it. And she's small and petite. And this is exactly how I see technology. Is like riding a horse. Bigger, stronger, faster, but we are actually there. And if we can embrace technology with love, but work within that, then it's great. My question to you is, are we actually doing it that way, or technology and just the chase towards data and the chase towards multi-billion, trillion-dollar companies taking us away from actually maintaining that sense of responsibility?
I believe we'll get there. I hope we'll get there. We're not there yet, and we're not there in every way in every place. But again, it's this iterative nature of innovation that will help us. I think you're seeing that today among founders, among venture capitalists. They're looking at things perhaps in a more altruistic view. They're looking at things in a more societal view than they have in the past. Not everyone, obviously, but the hope is that society comes together. And you're seeing it right now with climate change, where society is coming together and saying, this is important to us, and this is the direction that we want to go, and we need companies that will adhere to that.
Society is coming together, but governments are not. The US government is certainly in total denial in terms of climate change, so I beg to differ there. And there are many others who are also very slow because the lobby is extremely strong.
Yeah.
But putting all of that aside, I think even then, my view is, or rather my question to you is, that should we leave the future, our future, in the hands of 10 super smart people and great big fat companies? In other words, can we leave it to the private sector, whose motive is money and power?
Yeah, well, I think what you'll see is a variety of forces coming together. Clearly, there's areas where intervention, government intervention, or policy parameters, curbs, produce a better outcome. And again, going back to earlier statements, it's about creating markets that are well functioning. And we get to define what those markets look like. And when we find aberrations, when we find that the markets aren't functioning the way we want them to function, then we can create, again, tools or techniques to help address some of those issues.
What you're talking to me about here sounds very linear, while we're living in an exponential world. Secondly, 20, 30 companies are going to be managing the vast amount of really relevant data that we have. The Googles and the Tencents and the Alibabas of the world effectively know us more than we know ourselves. And they are effectively controlling us. And there is no real control. Nuclear weapons are controlled, airline traffic is controlled, the oil sector is controlled. Why isn't data controlled in exactly the same way? And to me, GDPR is it's a nice first step, but.
Sure. So I think it's too early to suggest that a small number of companies in the US or China are going to dictate terms for the rest of humanity. They clearly have tremendous force in certain marketplaces, but we've seen companies come and go for decades. Sure. And so things change over time. So I think it's too early to say which companies will be successful and which won't, and how they'll influence society more broadly.
So this data that these top 10, 20 companies are collecting and using has affected democracy, has affected our political system and discourse, has affected the information that we absorb and the information that we receive, and therefore, and with micro-targeting, effectively your constituent is down to one single person at a time as a micro target. So therefore you can influence anybody, anytime. That affects democracy, that affects the world. And this is controlled by very, very few people.
Yeah.
And it's not being regulated.
Well, so I think that some of that is true today, but just because some of that's true today doesn't mean that's going to be true tomorrow. I think one of the things we're discovering and we're learning is how we're influenced as individuals. And so knowledge is power. That's always been true, and that's always been the case. Yeah. Knowing how we're influenced and then addressing some of those issues, I think, becomes a key.
You have a lovely quote here. We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that is true in an environment where we're gathering more information. I think as I look forward, what I see is every individual, every executive becomes a data scientist. We'll become a data scientist for our own domains. And you discussed this, becoming and moving towards an internet of me, where the addressable market is one, the individual, and things are customized and personalized. And so because we're learning now the importance of data and the importance of influence, we can start to address those things. I think there's still going to be a tremendous opportunity to be human in the decade ahead. And when we look at who the robots are and who the computers are and the roles that we want to play in those environments, much of that is being explored today. We know, I think, very little of what we will know 10 years from now.
Friend, I love your the Internet of Me. It's the first time I've heard it, so you can own it. Another little statement you sort of put here was, it has been said that data collection is like garbage collection. Before you collect, you need to know where it actually goes. Are we actually doing that?
I think, again, we're starting to think about all of these issues. In the past, we talked a lot about data security, we talked a lot about privacy, we talked a lot about data ownership, but if we got offered a 10% coupon from a retailer, we'd sign over our address, our emails, our birthdays, everything. I think what we've learned in the last couple of years is that by digitizing and datafying our behavior, we're able to learn a lot more about us, and we're able to see that that our future can be influenced by information that is embedded within past behavior. Clearly, everything that's happened at Facebook has shown light onto that, but you see it in other areas as well. Anywhere that recommendation engines are at play suggests that your past behavior tells you more about yourself than you might know. And I think in the future moving forward, individuals are going to leverage that in ways that they want to leverage that information. I think they will have more control over how that information is used. Not all of that influence, by the way, is bad.
No,
and
absolutely.
what we've discovered is that sometimes you can influence yourself to feel less negative, to feel more positive. That may not always be a bad outcome.
Shawn, when you go into companies, what are the things that you're looking at in terms of making a difference in terms of their data usage and data requirements?
Executives today are trying to decipher what's going on in the world and understanding how digitization and datafication can redefine them. I think they're often looking too narrowly. So executives need to think about data in a much more broader sense, that it doesn't just change what they do, but it fundamentally changes the type of things that they can offer their customers and their employees.
When you go to schools and universities, you're a teacher yourself, what are you teaching them? What is your core message to a 13-year-old, and what's your core message to your graduate student at 23? Because
we allow so much to be automated in our life today, and that will only grow in the decade ahead, it's important to really focus on these cognitive capabilities, creativity, intuition, exploration. Things that are uniquely human become significantly more important in the decade ahead.
What keeps you up at night? What are you most worried about?
I think I worry about us getting it right. I worry about humans remaining humans and not becoming the robots. And we see that in so many different examples. Following GPS down the wrong way and ending up in a lake, listening to other technological influences. So I worry that we'll forget what it's like to connect with a human, and we'll lose sight of the value in these range of emotions.
Do you think the data, as we see it growing at this moment in time, should be controlled like nuclear weapons or proliferation of any other form of activity? In other words, I'm a freedom-loving person. I love to have freedom of choice and freedom of movement, but I'm also wary of the wrong people having too much data and too much control. On the one side, we have the positive people who are using data for good, but there's also corruption, there's also the anti-democratic environments, there are also various other elements, crime and so on. We're also using this data. Now, where I'm going with this question, I know it became a longer question, but where I'm going with this question is, what specific controls or methods would you recommend as an expert on data over the next, say, 5 years or so that we need to do to make sure that we are on the right trajectory?
transparency becomes an incredibly valuable tool. Transparency has been an incredibly valuable tool throughout history. And democracies are born from transparency. So with respect to data, it's important to understand what data companies have and how they're using it. And so just providing transparency will help alleviate some of the concerns that we have as we think of what the next decade will look like.
And any final advice to the companies that are out there, what they need to be doing tomorrow morning?
Companies need to recognize that all of these tools and techniques ultimately are designed to improve the world we live in, to improve society, to increase interactions, to improve enjoyment. So as companies build new tools, new techniques, as they employ new things, it isn't just about accomplishing something that's never been accomplished, but it's about making the world a better place and improving the lives around our lives. So it's key that companies focus on being human.
You know, I find it really, really refreshing, Shawn, that you have a positive perspective of the future and you are an optimist. I can see that. Is there any advice that you would like to give to pessimists out there and people who are cynical about the future?
There's definitely things that worry me, and there's lots of individuals out there that talk a lot about the dangers of these technologies. So I don't want to downplay the danger of datafication, but I am definitely an optimist. I believe in humans. They prove me wrong on occasion,
Yes.
but I always see people rise up when times really do get tough. You do see people come together to help each other out, and it's in these challenging times where we see the best characteristics and attributes